Let's talk about email, which I know does not sound like a lot of fun, but most church emails underperform for a reason that has very little to do with your subject line or your software or any of the other things that you may think is causing the underperformance. The real problem is usually a failure to match the person, the message, the timing, and the next step. So let's try to fix that. As you know, most churches, including yours probably, has an email problem, but it's probably not the problem you think you have. You may be looking at open rates. Your communications person is, A/B subject line testing. Somebody is wondering if Tuesday at 10 a.m. is better than Thursday at afternoon, and all of those are interesting conversations. And maybe somebody has already suggested, changing platforms because apparently no church problem is complete until we, blame the software, right? But there is a problem underneath all of those other things that actually may not even be a problem. Here's the problem. You're probably asking one email message to do many jobs. Do me a favor. Think about the people on your church email list right now, right? Someone visited for the first time 2 Sundays ago, and they are still trying to remember, where the kids' check-in area is. Someone on that email list has been attending for 9 months, and they really do like your church, and they've gotten to know some people, and they may even kind of show up more Sundays than not, but they haven't really moved much beyond showing up on a Sunday morning. And then you got somebody who has served for 6 years and they give consistently and they lead other people and you know them, they know you, they adore the mission, they are all in. And I mean, they are carrying a significant weight with you and the church. And again, there are people all in between this. And then here we are sending all of these people the exact same email with the same subject line, the same message, the same call to action. And then we're surprised when nobody does much with it. Listen, that is not a technology problem. That is a design problem. And I think this matters more than we sometimes may realize because church communication isn't just about distributing information, right? We are trying to help people move. I mean, church information is directly connected to spiritual formation. And in case you haven't noticed, what used to be the primary mechanism for information, the stage, has certainly moved digital. Email is your absolute best mechanism for sharing information, which means email could, I'm going to argue, should be one of your top priorities when you are thinking about spiritual formation and your discipleship pathway. I mean, think about it. We want somebody who is new to take another step, right? We want somebody who has been attending to engage a little more deeply. We want somebody who's already invested to increasingly own the mission. Those are very different outcomes, which means they probably require different kinds of communication. One email to everyone is one message to basically no one. Now, I know why churches do this. I used to do it this way for a very long time. It is efficient. That's the reason, right? You build one email, one newsletter, you load the list, you hit send, done. And listen, efficiency is important. Efficiency matters, right? Nobody needs, to spend, 3 additional full-time jobs, disguised as a communication strategy. Right? We don't, you don't have the margin for that. In fact, if you had a full-time job opening right now, I don't think you'd hire it for this. However, efficient and effective are not the same thing. And I know you know that, but let's just say it out loud. If the goal is getting the email sent, yeah, let's be efficient. One message works really, really well. But if the goal is helping people take an appropriate next step along their discipleship pathway, well, we got to think a little differently. Because the first question we should be asking about this really important email communication mechanism, the first question is not, what should this email say? That's a bad first question. The first question is, who is this email for? And I know that sounds obvious, but go look at your last 5 church emails. Who were they actually for? Not who were on the email list, who got them, not even who opened them, but who were they written for? I think you're going to find that that's an important question because when we write to everybody, we usually end up, and it's unconscious, but we unconsciously write to just generically somebody, and nobody really takes a step. So maybe it's the committed person because they, understand our language and maybe you wrote to that person. Or maybe you typically write to the newcomer because, you're trying so hard to make everything accessible for them. And the deeply engaged people, though, are not getting any messages that are helpful. I mean, again, either way you focus, one group is sitting somewhere, in the writer's mind, and everyone else just happens to be on the distribution list. So this is what I really want you to think about, right? When we think about communication, I want you to think through the lens of a person's readiness. All right, let's break this down. Like at its simplest way, right? The issue is getting the right person, the right message at the right time that leads to that right next step. Now, you've probably heard me talk about this before. That's a part of the framework, the 5 rights. In fact, I have a brand new book coming out September the 8th on this whole topic. It's called Remodel. 5 questions that will help you build and design everything more strategically in your church. So we're just talking about emails right here. But listen, this conversation is for everything that you do. So how can you make sure that the right person is getting the right message at the right time that leads to the right next step? That's discipleship thinking applied to email communication, right? So, for instance, just for example, imagine somebody who is very new to your church, right? They may kind of still be in what we would call the seeker stage because they are not a believer. They have shown up now once, twice. They are exploring, they are learning, they probably are curious, spiritually curious. No one shows up to churches anymore who don't have at least some level of spiritual curiosity, right? Or they may just be curious about your church because they know some people who go there and they're intrigued by how they live and love and they watch their marriages or maybe the way they parent, whatever it may be. But they're seekers. They are seeking something. They've been a few times. Your communication with that category of people needs to reflect where they are. It needs to be warm. It needs to be clear. It needs to be certainly free of assumptions. And it probably needs to have a very clear next step that feels safe, feels helpful, seems obvious for them. Right? You know what they don't need? They do not need 7 announcements. They certainly don't need like your internal ministry vocabulary, right? They don't know what next gen means or first steps or group link or whatever else, you use internally. And listen, it's okay to have those terms, but it isn't okay for this person. They don't know any of that. So you know what would be really helpful for them? Maybe an email that just says, thanks for being with us on Sunday. If you would like to learn a little more about our church, here is one simple next step for you. That might be all they need to hear from you for the first several weeks or even months, possibly. Now, compare that to someone who's been around for a long time, a good while. I mean, maybe a person who's attending and they're like a frequent attender and they know who you are. You've shook their hand, you've met them. They've probably heard your mission language enough times that they could maybe even repeat it back to you, right? I mean, their problem isn't orientation anymore, right? Their problem may be really taking a step. It may be movement. They don't need to hear, another generic update about all the different things that are happening, right? They need specific invitations. I mean, maybe things like this, hey, whatever their name is, you've been around for a few months and listen, we'd love to help you find a place to join a team. In fact, Sarah, making up a name, but on our team, Sarah is hosting a short conversation this Sunday between services beginning at 10:30. I'd love for you to meet her and I'd love to meet you again and walk you through what it looks like, not just to attend this church, but to become a part of creating this church. Now, think about those two things and notice kind of what happened there, right? I mean, we talked about a specific person who needs to get this, but we gave them a very specific time, a specific opportunity, a very specific next step. I mean, here's what we just did. We took abstract invitations off, get involved, right? We took that completely off the table and we turned it into something that somebody like this individual could actually do and probably fits the stage that they are in. I mean, I think about people in your church that, and I'll use my language again, but who are students or shapers in those two categories. Like they need to hear that kind of invitation, whereas your seekers need to hear something completely different, right? Because these are people who are now beginning to carry the mission. They may be serving or need to start. They might be giving or need to be challenged to. I mean, they're just at a different place. And so they need a different kind of conversation. They don't need to be, persuaded to come back. They need to be challenged to step up. They need to kind of see this church and the impact that they can have. They need to understand kind of where this church is going and how they can be a part of it. They need communication from you that respects where they are. So instead of another broad email that just says, we need some volunteers, maybe they receive a story that says, because of the way that you have served this semester, 42 middle school students had an adult who knew their name every Wednesday night, right? Think about how different that kind of thing can land for people. Different message because they are at a different place. And this is why segmentation isn't primarily a marketing technique, okay? It is an acknowledgement that different people are in different places. And when you can acknowledge that, it changes what you realize people need to hear from you. And it also changes when they need to hear it, right? Churches tend to just communicate based on calendars, but the newsletter, that goes out on the first Tuesday, right, of the month, and the events email that goes out 2 weeks before the event, and, the giving email that goes out towards the year end. And I mean, that's fine. And those aren't necessarily bad rhythms, but you kind of need an operational rhythm, not just a calendar rhythm, because readiness doesn't really care about the calendar. So if someone visits your church on a Sunday, the best time to communicate with them probably isn't whenever the next newsletter goes out. It's probably within, 48 hours where all their experience is still fresh. And the email may just be as simple as we said, thank you for coming. Here's what you may want to know about us. And here's something you could consider doing next if you want to find out if this church could become your church. I mean, it could be that simple. However, you would also want to maybe remove them from that generic email newsletter, maybe until they come back a second or third time, right? Like if somebody's been attending for 6 months and you know that you have a perfect opportunity for someone like them in this category, where they could serve beginning, in a couple of Sundays, and there's an opportunity that's low-hanging fruit, maybe a guest services, hospitality kind of thing. Well, you don't want to send a generic email out every spring with that ask because, maybe they started showing up in the summer and now they are primed. It's 3 months into their tenure at your church, right? So again, the more we can segment our population, the smarter we can be with what we communicate, the clearer we can be, and definitely the better the next step can be. When you do that, things can happen in your church and even more importantly, in the lives of the people that you are trying to grow in your church too. I think this is where, most churches kind of just confuse communication consistency with communication effectiveness. And I would never tell you that consistency doesn't matter. Of course it does. But you can consistently send the wrong message to the wrong people and get no progress out of it. So consistency on its own is not a great goal, right? You can be very disciplined, but also be ineffective. So here's what I would love for you to do. I don't want you to rebuild your entire communication strategy. I mean, that's a pretty daunting process, right? But I also, and I don't want you to purchase more platforms or anything like that. I just would love for you to maybe you put a task force on this, right? Just grab a handful of people. Maybe they're volunteers, maybe they're a couple of staff members or an elder or two, whatever you have access to do. But give them 6 weeks to decide what audiences in your church deserve unique communication. Now, again, in my book, Remodel, I talk a lot about some of these things, but just for yourself, whether you have the book or not, you could sit down and try to parse out a few different segments of people. And then after you do it, run a test with these people and pay attention to next steps and pay attention to open rates and all those kinds of things and see what happens. I can tell you at Woodstock City, where I led for all those years, we did this and it made such a difference for our email strategy. For a very long time, we would just send an every Thursday, if I remember, email out to everybody who was a parent in our church that had a child that had checked into our church at any point, probably in the last 6 months, maybe 9 months. And that was fine. We were getting a lot of information out and a lot of parents were getting information. However, I'm not sure that all the parents were getting what they needed. And they were definitely getting more than they needed. And I can tell you that because I was one of those parents. We have 4 children. And I had at one point, a child in each of these different categories. I had a high school student, I had a middle school student, elementary, preschool, and we were getting this one email with all this stuff on it. It was a lot of stuff, but at least I had a kid in each environment. Well, guess what? Pretty soon I didn't have a kid in each environment. We were down to 2 environments, yet I'm still getting an email with superfluous information that means nothing to me. So you know what we did? And it took some work, but we began to segment our church email list of parents by where they had children. And then we began sending out separate emails depending on who they were, so they got what they needed. If you didn't have a high school student, you weren't getting any high school information. If you had an elementary student, though, you were definitely getting the elementary information. Now, you could take this as far as you want, but I will promise you, the more you segment your list, the better you'll be able to articulate the verbiage, the content, the body copy in that email. The more people will pay attention, the more engagement will go up, and then more importantly, the more next steps will be taken. Hey, on this podcast, we talk about how to lead more intentionally. This might be the most intentional thing you can do around communication because email is king. So let's treat it as if it actually matters that much.